You don't own this cabin anymore, Grant. You just haven't accepted it yet. Those were the words Victoria Langford said to me on a cold October morning while standing on my own front porch, her polished smile fixed in place like she'd already won. The lake wind rolled across the water behind her, carrying the smell of wet cedar and the sharp bite of approaching rain. Fog hung low over the shoreline, pressing against the fishing docks below the cabin. My coffee thermos sat untouched on the railing. Across the gravel driveway, 3 pickup trucks belonging to local contractors had stopped moving. Their owners were watching. Nobody spoke. That silence felt louder than shouting. Victoria wasn't alone. Her 27-year-old son Brandon stood beside her with his hands in his jacket pockets, already looking around the property like he was deciding where to put furniture. Then Victoria pointed toward the cabin door and said, "Brandon needs a fresh start. This place would be perfect for him." She didn't ask. She announced it, like she was delivering a board decision instead of trying to take something that belonged to my family. The rain began tapping softly against the metal roof overhead. "That's not happening," I told her. Calm. No anger. No performance. Just the truth. Victoria laughed lightly and looked back toward the small group gathering near the driveway. "See," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that creates division in a community." A few uncomfortable glances followed. Nobody agreed with her. Nobody challenged her either. That's how people like Victoria survived. They turned social pressure into a weapon. If you've ever dealt with someone who acts like they own everything around them, comment below with your city and tell me if you've ever met your neighborhood version of Victoria Langford. Because what happened next only got worse. Much worse. Victoria stepped closer. Her voice dropped low enough that only I could hear it. "You should think carefully before making this difficult. The board is already discussing several concerns regarding your property." There it was. The threat hidden beneath the smile. Classic HOA politics. Public charm. Private pressure. Brandon smirked without saying a word. He looked confident. Entitled. Certain. The kind of confidence that only comes from believing someone else will clean up your mistakes. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the far side of the lake. The muddy shoreline below the cabin reflected the darkening sky. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Victoria reached into her leather folder and handed me a sealed envelope. "You'll want to read that today." She turned and walked away before I could respond. Brandon followed. Halfway down the gravel drive, he looked back at the cabin one more time. Not like a visitor. Like a buyer waiting for closing day. The moment their SUV disappeared around the bend, I opened the envelope. What I found inside made one thing painfully clear. Victoria wasn't bluffing anymore. The envelope contained 3 pages, and by the time I finished reading them, the rain had turned steady enough to blur the lake beyond the windows. Victoria had not filed a complaint. She had drafted a proposal. According to the document, the board would soon vote on a new community initiative that would convert certain waterfront properties into what she called shared recreational assets. The language sounded professional. The intent was obvious. My cabin sat at the top of the list. I lowered the papers and looked across the room at a framed photograph of my father standing on this same porch in 1993, holding a stringer of bass after a morning on the lake. For the first time that day, something cold settled in my chest. Not fear exactly. Something heavier. The realization that this was no longer about HOA politics. Victoria wanted a legacy that was not hers. Outside, fog drifted over the water and swallowed half the fishing docks. Rain tapped against the metal roof in a slow rhythm. I spent the afternoon fixing a loose railing and trying not to think about the proposal. Then my phone started vibrating. One message after another. A neighbor asking if the rumors were true. Another asking whether I was planning to sell. Someone else simply wrote, "Sorry, Grant." By dinner, the entire community seemed convinced the cabin was already changing hands. The speed of it caught my attention. Rumors do not spread that fast without help. The next morning, I stopped at a diner near the county highway. The place smelled like coffee, bacon, and wet jackets. A few residents from the lake community were already there. Normally they waved. This time conversation stopped when I walked in. Not hostile, just cautious. Like people thought they were watching the first act of a public dispute and did not want to stand too close. Then I noticed something else. 2 tables away sat Brandon. He was showing pictures on his phone to another resident. I could not hear everything, but I heard enough. "When I move in," he said. "Move in. Not if. When." The confidence surprised me. I finished my coffee, paid the check, and left without saying a word. Back at the cabin, another surprise was waiting. A delivery truck had dropped off a packet addressed to me from an anonymous sender. Inside was a copy of a neighborhood email chain. Victoria had been privately telling residents for weeks that I was considering donating the cabin to a community trust. The message was false, completely false. But suddenly the rumors made sense. The proposal, the pressure, the public expectations. Somebody had been laying groundwork long before she stepped onto my porch. Standing there with rain falling across the gravel driveway and lake wind pushing through the pines, I realized something important. Victoria was not reacting to an opportunity. She had been planning this for a very long time. If you noticed anything that could have been better in this story or video, feel free to leave your feedback. We would love to improve and make the next video even better. The following week felt different. Not louder, worse. The kind of pressure that settles over a place like fog over water and never quite lifts. Every morning I stepped onto the porch and found something new waiting for me. A neighbor who suddenly looked away. A conversation that stopped when I approached. A rumor that had somehow grown larger overnight. By Tuesday, people were not asking whether I planned to give up the cabin anymore. They were asking when. That was the moment I understood how effective Victoria's campaign had become. She was not trying to convince me. She was trying to convince everyone else that the outcome had already been decided. The lake community held a seasonal gathering that Friday evening at the Marina Pavilion. Normally it was simple. Coffee, sandwiches, fishing stories, complaints about weather. This year the atmosphere felt like a courthouse waiting room before a hearing. Rain drummed against the metal roof. Cold wind pushed fog across the docks. Residents stood in small groups, speaking quietly. When I arrived, several people nodded politely, but nobody seemed comfortable. Then Victoria entered. She moved through the crowd smiling, touching shoulders, greeting people by name. The performance was flawless. Brandon followed a few steps behind, carrying himself like a future homeowner. Halfway through the evening, Victoria stepped onto the small platform near the marina office. Community preservation requires difficult conversations, she announced. Sometimes individual interests must support the greater good. Nobody missed the target of that statement. Her eyes found me immediately. The silence afterward stretched longer than the speech itself. Then something unexpected happened. An older resident named Walter Briggs stood up from his table. Walter rarely spoke at community events. The greater good usually starts with asking permission, he said. Not angry, just matter of fact. A few heads turned. Victoria's smile tightened for the first time. Nobody is taking anything, Walter. Then why is your son already telling people he is moving in? The room went quiet again. Brandon looked down at his shoes. Victoria recovered quickly, but not completely. A crack had appeared. Small, but visible. Later that night, while rain washed across the gravel parking area, Walter caught up with me near the boat launch. He handed me a folded piece of paper. You did not get this from me. Before I could ask another question, he walked away. Inside was a copy of meeting notes from a private HOA committee session held 3 months earlier. My cabin had been discussed by name. Not recently. Not after the proposal. 3 months earlier. Long before Victoria showed up on my porch. Standing there beside the dark water, listening to waves tap against the dock pilings, I felt something shift inside me. The fear of losing my father's legacy was still there. But for the first time, it was being replaced by something else. Strategy. Because if Victoria had been coordinating this for months, then somewhere along the way she had left tracks. And people were finally starting to notice them. Rank the story from 10 to 0. I would love to know what you think. The committee notes stayed on my kitchen table all weekend. I must have read them 20 times. Not because they were complicated, because they changed everything. Until that moment, I had been dealing with a hostile HOA president. Now I was looking at evidence that a coordinated plan had existed months before anyone mentioned community assets, preservation projects, or shared use proposals. Monday arrived under a ceiling of low-gray clouds. Fog drifted across the lake and settled over the muddy shoreline below the cabin. The cold morning air carried the smell of wet cedar and rain-soaked pine needles. I poured coffee from my thermos and watched a pair of fishing boats disappear into the mist. Usually the view calmed me. That morning it did not. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Linda Mercer, a resident who had barely spoken to me in weeks. Her voice sounded nervous. Grant, I think you should know something. She explained that several homeowners had recently received invitations to what Victoria described as an informal planning session. Not a board meeting, not an official vote, just a gathering. The topic was supposedly future community development. My cabin was listed on the agenda. Were you invited? I asked. Silence answered the question. No, Linda admitted. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. The emotional weight hit harder than I expected. This cabin was where my father taught me to fish, where my parents celebrated their anniversary, where every major family memory seemed to begin. And now people were discussing its future in rooms I was not allowed to enter. That realization hurt more than the legal threats ever had. By afternoon, the rain arrived. I drove into town and stopped near the county courthouse. Water ran down the stone steps. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. The whole place felt heavy with unresolved business. Inside a small cafe across the street, I met Walter Briggs. He slid into the booth carrying a worn folder. You are not the only person she has tried this with, he said quietly. Then he opened the folder. Inside were letters from years earlier involving another waterfront property owner who had eventually sold and moved away. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just pressure, rumors, endless community campaigns until resistance became exhausting. A pattern. That was the discovery that stayed with me. Victoria did not create conflict. She manufactured isolation. She made people feel alone until they surrendered. But something else happened while Walter and I talked. 2 residents entered the cafe. Then another. Then another. They recognized the folder. They recognized Walter. And for the first time, nobody lowered their voice when Victoria's name came up. The fear that had protected her for years was beginning to weaken. She did not know it yet, but public opinion had started moving in a direction she could no longer control. By Wednesday, the weather had turned colder. Wind pushed across the lake in long gray waves, rattling dock cleats and sending damp leaves skittering across the gravel driveway. The cabin felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because every room carried the weight of what was coming. I found myself staring longer at old photographs, lingering over details I had ignored for years. My father standing beside a string of trout. My mother laughing on the dock during a summer storm. The place was becoming more valuable the harder someone tried to take it. That afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. It was not Walter. It was Denise Holloway, one of the HOA's former treasurers. She parked her pickup near the boat launch and stood looking at the water for nearly a minute before walking up to the porch. I should have said something years ago, she told me. There was exhaustion in her voice. Not fear. Regret. We sat outside while fog drifted over the shoreline below. Denise explained that Victoria had spent years presenting herself as the community's protector while quietly steering decisions toward a much smaller circle of people. Most residents never noticed because the changes happened gradually. One proposal here, one exception there, one favor granted quietly. Then she handed me something that made my stomach tighten. It was a copy of an old budget discussion. Buried inside was a rejected proposal from nearly 2 years earlier. Brandon's name appeared in it, not directly as a beneficiary, but close enough to raise questions. The proposal would have funded improvements to a parcel of waterfront property that Brandon had once attempted to purchase. The deal collapsed. The funding request disappeared. Then, months later, attention shifted toward my cabin. Suddenly, a pattern emerged. The realization hit hard. This was never about community development. It was about finding a solution for Brandon. Driving home after Denise left, I passed the community mailbox area and noticed several residents gathered nearby. Normally, conversations stopped when I approached. This time they did not. One woman actually waved me over. Another asked if the stories about secret planning meetings were true. Public perception was changing. Slowly, but noticeably. The gossip that had once worked against me was beginning to move in the opposite direction. That evening, Victoria called for the first time in weeks. Her voice carried the same polished confidence, but something underneath sounded strained. Grant, misunderstandings are creating unnecessary tension. I almost laughed. Is that what we are calling it now? Silence. Then she tried a different approach. People are becoming confused. You could help calm things down. Translation: stop asking questions. Stop talking to residents. Stop connecting dots. I looked out at the dark water beyond the porch. Thunder rolled somewhere across the lake. The truth usually clears up confusion, I said. The line went quiet for several seconds before she ended the call. For the first time since this began, Victoria was not trying to pressure me. She was trying to contain something. And whatever she was afraid of had finally started moving on its own. The next morning, I stopped waiting for the situation to reveal itself and started treating it like a problem that needed a strategy. Rain had fallen most of the night. Water dripped from the cedar beams outside the cabin. Fog pressed low across the lake, turning the shoreline into a gray blur. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, a fresh pot of coffee, and something I had not felt in weeks: clarity. Victoria wanted everyone focused on emotions, rumors, and community pressure. Fine. I was done playing on that field. By noon, I had scheduled meetings with my insurance agent, a land surveyor, and an attorney who specialized in property access disputes. None of those conversations felt dramatic. That was the point. Real problems usually collapse because of paperwork nobody thinks to read until it is too late. 2 days later, I met the surveyor at the cabin. We walked the property line along the western edge near the old service road that connected several community facilities to the main highway. Cold wind rolled off the water while mud clung to our boots. Halfway through the inspection, the surveyor stopped, looked at an old boundary marker, then checked his map again. "That is interesting," he said. "Professionals almost never say those words unless something important has surfaced." Later that afternoon, he explained that several access routes being used by the community appeared to rely on historical agreements rather than direct ownership. Not illegal, not necessarily improper, but far more complicated than anyone realized. I did not celebrate. I simply listened. Strategy requires patience. Meanwhile, social pressure continued shifting. At the marina, residents were openly discussing Victoria's private meetings. At the diner near the county highway, conversations no longer stopped when I entered. They stopped when her name entered the conversation. Even people who still supported her sounded uneasy. Nobody likes discovering they may have been manipulated. The biggest surprise came from an insurance consultant. During a routine discussion, he asked a simple question: "Has the board disclosed all property control assumptions to its liability carrier?" I stared at him. He stared back. Suddenly, both of us understood the same thing. If certain facilities were operating under assumptions that were inaccurate, the exposure could become significant. Not because anyone had done anything malicious. Because organizations hate uncertainty, especially insurers. That evening, Victoria appeared at my driveway without warning. Her smile was still there, but the confidence looked thinner. "You have been making a lot of calls," she said. "I have been gathering information," I replied. She folded her arms. "People are beginning to misunderstand the board's intentions." There it was again. The word people. Not facts. Not documents. People. "Then clarity should help everyone," I said. For a moment, she looked genuinely unsettled. Just a flicker. Then she left. As her vehicle disappeared through the fog, I realized the balance had shifted. For weeks, Victoria had controlled the narrative. Now she was reacting to mine. 3 days later, the monthly community meeting arrived, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I walked into the clubhouse without feeling like I was stepping into enemy territory. Rain streaked across the tall windows. The parking lot outside was packed with pickup trucks and sedans. Inside, the atmosphere felt strange. Not hostile. Uncertain. People were talking, but quietly. Small groups formed and dissolved. Conversations stopped whenever Victoria entered a section of the room, then resumed the moment she walked away. That was new. For years, she had controlled every room simply by entering it. Now her presence seemed to create discomfort instead of authority. I took a seat near the back. Several residents nodded at me. A few even walked over to shake my hand. Nothing dramatic, just enough to be noticed. Across the room, Victoria saw it too. Her smile appeared on schedule, but it looked increasingly expensive to maintain. The meeting began. Routine items, maintenance reports, budget updates, committee announcements. Then came public comments. Normally that portion moved quickly because most people preferred avoiding conflict. Not this time. Walter Briggs stood first. He calmly asked why informal planning sessions had been held without broader community notice. Another resident asked whether property discussions involving private owners had occurred before official board review. Then Denise Holloway spoke. The room became so quiet that the sound of rain hitting the metal gutters outside seemed louder than the meeting itself. Denise did not accuse anyone. She simply described her experiences as former treasurer and encouraged greater transparency. That single word landed harder than any accusation could have. Transparency. People started looking at one another. The silence that followed felt like pressure building before a thunderstorm. Victoria attempted to regain control. Unfortunately, misinformation has been circulating recently, she said. Her voice remained polished, but the room no longer reacted the way it once had. Nobody rushed to defend her. Nobody echoed her talking points. The automatic support she depended on simply was not there. Then an elderly resident named Frank Mercer asked a question that changed everything. If this was always about community benefit, why was Brandon discussing occupancy plans before any vote happened? Nobody spoke. Brandon was sitting near the front. Several heads turned toward him. His face reddened instantly. Victoria answered for him. People are reading far too much into casual conversations. But the explanation arrived too late. The damage was already done. You could feel it. Community gossip had finally crossed into public scrutiny. On the way out, something happened that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Victoria stood near the entrance greeting residents. One after another, people walked past her. Not rudely, not aggressively. They simply kept moving. The isolation was subtle, which somehow made it worse. As I stepped outside into the cold evening air, thunder rolled across the lake in the distance. Behind me, Victoria remained standing alone under the clubhouse lights while the crowd drifted away. For the first time, she looked less like the person running the community and more like someone slowly losing it. The fallout from the meeting spread faster than any rumor Victoria had ever managed to control. By Monday morning, the community bulletin board was covered with notices for a special board session. Residents were talking openly now. At the diner near the county highway, conversations no longer lowered when board business came up. They got louder. Questions were being asked that nobody had dared ask before. The weather matched the mood. Cold rain swept across the lake. Fog pressed against the shoreline. Water drummed steadily on metal roofs throughout the community. I spent most of the morning at the cabin reviewing notes with my attorney. We were not chasing rumors anymore. We were organizing facts. Around noon, he received a call and slowly leaned back in his chair. Well, he said, that escalated. An insurance compliance inquiry had been opened after questions surfaced regarding property access assumptions connected to several community facilities. Nobody was accusing anyone of wrongdoing. But once outside reviewers started asking questions, organizations tended to become extremely cautious. Liability fear moves faster than gossip. By late afternoon, the special board session began at the clubhouse. Every parking space was full. Pickup trucks lined the gravel shoulder. Residents packed the room. The atmosphere felt less like a meeting and more like a hearing. Rain streaked down the windows while thunder rolled somewhere across the lake. Victoria entered carrying the same folder she always carried, but the room did not react. No welcoming smiles. No automatic support. Just silence. Real silence. The kind that makes people aware of every footstep. Then something happened that nobody expected. 2 representatives from the county planning office arrived. They were not there to punish anyone. They were there to request clarification regarding several access and property use questions that had recently surfaced. Their presence alone changed the entire room. Institutional attention has a way of stripping drama out of a situation and replacing it with consequences. Victoria attempted to take control immediately. This is simply a misunderstanding, she said. One of the officials nodded politely. That is what we are here to determine. The answer landed harder than any argument. For the next hour, residents watched as board members struggled to explain decisions that suddenly sounded much less confident under outside review. Several directors appeared visibly uncomfortable. One eventually announced that all discussions involving private waterfront properties would be suspended pending further evaluation. The room erupted with conversation. Victoria remained seated. Brandon looked stunned. As people filed out into the rain afterward, nobody gathered around them. Nobody sought their guidance. Nobody asked what came next. Standing beneath the clubhouse lights, Victoria looked toward the parking lot and saw something she had not seen in years. The community moving forward without waiting for her. The final collapse did not happen with shouting, lawsuits, or dramatic speeches. It happened the way most real collapses happen. Quietly at first, then all at once. Over the following 3 weeks, the board suspended every proposal connected to private waterfront properties. Several directors publicly requested independent review of past decisions. Residents who had spent years avoiding conflict suddenly began attending meetings in record numbers. The atmosphere around the community changed almost overnight. At the diner near the county highway, people no longer whispered about Victoria. They discussed her openly. At the marina, neighbors who had avoided eye contact for weeks now stopped to talk. The social isolation she once used against others had somehow circled back toward her. Then came the special election. Rain fell most of that morning. The courthouse clock downtown stood against a gray sky while water ran along the curbs and gathered in shallow puddles. I did not attend to make a statement. I attended because after everything that had happened, I wanted to see the community decide its own future. The results were not close. Victoria resigned before the final tally was even announced. No speech, no explanation, no graceful farewell. She simply left through a side door while residents remained inside, discussing what came next. The strange part was that I did not feel victorious. Not in the way I expected. For months, I had imagined some perfect moment where everything would suddenly feel resolved. Instead, I felt tired, relieved, human. The anger that had carried me through the fight was finally fading. A few days later, I saw Brandon at the gas station outside town. He looked older somehow, less certain. He nodded once. I guess things got out of hand. It was the first honest thing I had heard from him since this began. That happens when people stop listening, I said. He looked down for a moment, then quietly agreed. We never spoke about it again. The real reward arrived on a cold Saturday morning near the end of the season. Fog drifted across the lake. The shoreline was damp from overnight rain. I walked down to the dock carrying a coffee thermos that had become a permanent companion through this entire ordeal. The fishing boat sat exactly where they always had. The water moved gently against the pilings. Nothing about the property had changed, and yet everything felt different. The cabin was still mine. The family photographs were still hanging inside. The memories remained exactly where they belonged. More importantly, so did my dignity. Looking back, the lesson was surprisingly simple. Power survives on silence longer than it survives on authority. Once people stop being afraid to ask questions, even the strongest social control begins to crack. As the morning fog slowly lifted from the water, I stood on the dock listening to the lake wind move through the cedar trees. The community behind me was quieter now. Healthier, maybe. But just as I turned back toward the cabin, my phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. One sentence. You still have not seen everything in the old property files. I stared at the screen while thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the far side of the lake.